Okay, today we're talking about portable buildings, or what today would be called prefabricated buildings. And this is the first European house built in Australia for Governor Arthur Phillip at Sydney. And the question is, what is it made of? Now, you might look at it and say it's probably a brick house covered in stucco, but I'm actually talking about not that two-storey house, but the one in the background which you see here. And when you look at that closely, you can see that it's a grid structure. There's a frame which actually is timber and panels which are covered in oilcloth. Now, oilcloth is a material invented in the 18th century. Before we had linoleum, it was used on floors. It's a canvas or calico material impregnated with wax and rosin and other materials. Lighter grades were used on furniture. Sometimes it was used on the roofs of buildings or even on the walls of buildings. So a very flexible material. And it was like a framed tent, this building. And only one other building in the world, or only one building in the world, survives of this material. It's an ornamental garden tent in England here, made by Smith and Baber, and Smith and Baber were the people who made Governor Phillip's oilcloth house. This, of course, is a highly ornamental one in the Chinese style. Says the underside of the roof with dragons on it. After that first building in Sydney, very few buildings were imported to Australia for half a century. The main impetus for prefabrication is that manufacturing costs are cheaper in the country of origin than the place of destination. And in the 19th century, manufacturing costs meant mainly labour, and of course in Australia convict labour was virtually free. So Sydney very soon stopped importing buildings and began making them itself. They were sent from Sydney to outlying Australian settlements. One or two American houses got here because of the connection with the whaling trade, which was dominated by Boston, but there wasn't much other importation. What did happen, and if we just summarise the developments, the first houses made in Sydney went to Newcastle and Van Diemen's Land, that is modern Tasmania, in 1805. A house was sent from Sydney to New Zealand in 1806. Then when Moreton Bay was opened up, the predecessor of Brisbane, our buildings were sent there, and I'll just mention some of these other ones later on as we go on. This is the building that was sent to New Zealand, not the first time. The first building was destroyed for political reasons, but this is the building sent for the British resident James Busby at Waitangi, designed and made in Sydney, designed by John Verge and modified by Ambrose Hallen. So it's a major prefabricated structure. These buildings were in fact a tool of diplomacy. The first building that went to New Zealand was presented by Governor King to a Maori chief who visited Sydney, Te Pahi, and it was sent to New Zealand, and a crew of men from the ship put it up, staying for 5 days with a carpenter. But later on there was a punitive expedition which destroyed it because Te Pahi was supposed to be involved in the massacre of the boys, an atrocity which I won't go into now. So that building was there for diplomatic reasons and destroyed for similar reasons, and this is a more important building which took its place in 1832. Now, another form of prefabrication in the early part of the 19th century were these convict stations. Convicts worked on the roads and their accommodation moved with them. It came in two forms. This type, which is totally demountable and reassembled at the next location, but others were like caravans, and they were towed along the road. And if you look at the plan on the right, you can see that there are four bunks down each side, or four sleeping places down each side. There are 2 levels, so altogether there are 16 convicts crammed into that little room. And I can imagine the smells of farting and so on that would have pervaded the confined atmosphere. Like a sort of giant filing cabinet. Now, among the buildings made in Sydney, other than convict stations, was this house here which came to Melbourne, Captain Lonsdale's cottage. Captain Lonsdale came to Melbourne as the first police magistrate, and his house was made in Sydney by the Royal Engineers at Parramatta in 1836, and the following year sent down to Melbourne on the schooner Isabella. The larger components were carried on the deck of the ship. Unfortunately, storms were encountered and some of the material was jettisoned into the sea and had to be replaced with new timber when the cargoers got to to Melbourne. Now we need to look at where this went. This is a plan of Melbourne, and if you look at the diagonal part in the middle, that's what's now the CBD, and the horizontal line above it is Victoria Street, Victoria Parade. Then you can see East Melbourne to the right of it, with the streets marked out. Below that, the end of Wellington Parade, closest to Spring Street, is an angled line, and that's the top of Lonsdale's allotments. In fact, that angled line is because Lonsdale had built on there before the road was surveyed, and so they couldn't take Wellington Parade straight through his house. So that's where he was. And later on, Superintendent Latrobe bought his land next door in what became Jolimont. There's the detail showing the two locations. Now, this is the form of house which was sent from Sydney, or was supposed to have been sent from Sydney by the Royal Engineers. Except, of course, the brick fireplaces shown there would have to be built in Melbourne, not sent from Sydney. And here it is again in section. It shows a few interesting aspects. One is that the base plates carry the floor joists, not the other way around. Today in Australia, more commonly, you have platform frame construction where you build the floor and you build the walls on top. This is more typical of North America, the balloon frame of the United States. There's no special connection, but it's the alternative way of framing a house. Now, there are problems when this house was put up. If you look at this picture of it here, there's something odd about the roof. I'll give you a moment to think what it is. Well, what it is that the back roof slope seems to be shallower than the front roof slope. You can see that there. And the reason apparently is that the wrong shaped roof was supplied with the building. The building came with, as typical of the time, with a way bill of stores or a bill of lading which listed all the components were sent. And I was able from that list to reconstruct the form of the roof, which you see here. The problem with this reconstructed roof is it's too small for the building below it. So it seems that they built the house with the roof at the front, and then they changed the slope at the back to cover the leftover bit of house at the back. The house stayed there on the site even after Lonsdale left Melbourne and was used by government officials such as a bandmaster until the 1890s, when the Collingwood Railway line and the railway yards generally were put through that area, and the house had to be demolished. So this is the condition of Lonsdale House as it had been extended to either side by 1891, just before it was demolished. And these are the stages. So there's the house at the top, which is supplied with the roof of the wrong size. The house that's built with the roof skewed. Then the extensions made, which are to the back, which were made during Lonsdale's occupation, and the structures built on either side in the period after Lonsdale left. Now, this was being sold to be demolished, but in fact, somebody bought the house and moved it. They bought the house in this condition, as it was, and they then moved it to Carrum to become a holiday house. Here it is at Carrum, seen in the 1950s. So they've just moved the central part of the house, not the extension on either side, and there it is. Now, in the 1950s, this house was discovered at Carrum and was acquired by the Young National Trust, put on a low loader and brought back to Melbourne. On the way, unfortunately, some of the house fell off the back of the low loader, and so the timbers had to be replaced in due course. What happened was the house was put into storage, and it was stored at the yard of John Holland, the builder, for a couple of years, and the missing timber was replaced. But then Hollands got impatient, nothing was being done with the house, so it had to be dismantled and moved away, and it was stored in piles under iron sheets at Como, where the National Trust headquarters then was, Como House in South Yarra. Until in 1973, it was found by chance that people had been using bits of the house on the Moomba float and as doors on the Como lavatories. So we got all the components out and did an inventory to find what was there, and we found the pieces there were now mixed up with parts of other buildings, especially McRae's cottage, and so we took out the authentic material and had it put into commercial storage, where it stayed for some time. Then it was moved to be stored in the stables at another National Trust property, Glenfern. So after another 12 years, a further inventory was taken. By that time, we could only find these components which we were sure were part of the original house. So this, which was the first A-classified house of the National Trust in Victoria, had been reduced to a couple of a window sill and a window head. The National Trust had destroyed its own A-classified building. There are the remaining components. Another early house, or early building, is this one, the Steam Packet Inn at Portland in Western Victoria. This was brought from Tasmania, but it's not totally clear whether it was a prefabricated building complete or whether it was building materials pre-cut in Tasmania, or precisely how much prefabrication was involved. It was, of course, a private acquisition, nothing by the Royal Engineers or the government, and it has some interesting constructional characteristics. One of them is this. Being a two-storey building, the upper floor has to be supported. And what's been done here is, in the joists, a ledger has been put through. That is a horizontal beam, ledger or ribbon it's termed. It looks as though it takes up the whole almost the whole depth of the stud, but in fact it's halved in. So most of the stud is still intact behind it. That serves the purpose of supporting the joists for the upper floor, and the joists are spiked into the stud above. Now, once again, this is like American construction, not like later Australian construction, where you tend to finish the ground floor, put a floor on, and then build a new floor on top as a separate exercise. Here, the studs go through both levels, so it's again an interesting, apparently American connection. Now we come back to the real importation of buildings from England. By the time that the new settlements were established, that is not Sydney and Hobart, but Adelaide and Perth, and in due course Melbourne, prefabrication was required once again. And the main prefabricators in England were Peter Thomson and Henry Manning. Turning first to Peter Thomson. Peter Thomson made emigrants' houses for the South Australian Company in South Australia, including these semi-detached cottage pairs, but he also made large houses for members of the establishment, important officials and so on in the government. And a number of versions of this plan were made by Thomson. The main characteristic is it has a long row of the major rooms along the front, with one projecting at either end, and a wide corridor behind, linking them all together. This is common through a number of his plans. And here's an example of that. The difference is that there's a bay in the middle, a polygonal bay in the middle. But this is a house which Thomson built for a judge in New Zealand. The plan is perhaps not entirely accurate, but it gives an indication of that same sort of arrangement. And here's an example in Melbourne. This is Woodlands at Oaklands Junction near Tullamarine Airport. It's deceptive because the granite columned porch there, the whole veranda is later, but otherwise the building is surprisingly intact behind. Here's a model. We were looking at what's now the bottom left-hand corner, and the whole of that grey part is the original prefabricated house made by Peter Thomson in London. The courtyard extension is also early, within the first few years, and contains a number of components by Peter Thomson or possibly other prefabricators. So it's also very interesting. It contains things like cast iron sashes, which both Thomson and Manning sometimes supplied with their wooden houses. And today, although there's been some work at the bottom of the picture where there's now a dining room and kitchen, most of the structure survives fairly intact. So you see things like this ceiling, in which there's a grid and panels drop into it. This is quite common in prefabricated houses of the 19th century. Then where the roof has been opened for inspection, you can see very lightweight trusses, much lighter than normal in the 19th century. This is again characteristic of these buildings. There are cast iron sashes from the courtyard part of the building, but also, as I said, early and probably from one of these prefabricators. Inside, probably original, is this extraordinary decoration, rather naive imitation marbling. It resembles what you might find in late 18th century Sweden or other European sort of peasant places. A naive version of the Ionic order and this strange marbling in between. But that's of course not part of the prefabrication system, but it's very early decoration in Australian terms. There's another of the cast iron sash piers. Here's another odd house. This is not by either of those two major makers, but it was exported to Melbourne in 1853. So we're now at the end of that early period, because where the gold rush has come. This is a house built for the gold rush. We don't know what happened to it, But there's one thing I'd point out about it is it seems to be made of flush boarding. It is not weather boarding or vertical boarding, but horizontal boarding with a flush vertical surface. And I'm going to come back to that point a little later on. Now turning to Henry Manning. Manning is different from Thomson as a prefabricator because he makes large houses for officials like Thomson, but also has his own special system he invents for smaller houses. This is where he seems to have begun, building this house at St. Helena for Napoleon when he was in exile. In the end, Napoleon never moved in, but it was a very large house, apparently made by Manning. We don't know whether made by him as a contractor for the government or whether he was at that time employed in the government dockyards, which the history is not clear. But he went on to make this house for New Zealand, the first government house in New Zealand, which was compared with the previous one in some of the contemporary reports. So this is the first government house at Auckland, made by Henry Manning of London and supervised by William Mason, who was to become the New Zealand colonial architect. Two views of it, they're not easy to reconcile exactly, but they're the two different views. This is what he invented for smaller buildings. A system where you have grooved posts, square posts with 1, 2, 3 or 4 grooves in the sides, into which you can slot a fixed panel, like a sort of large door, or you can slot a panel with a window, or you can slot a door. So you can more or less design your own house. You would go to Manning's yard, instead of placing your order and waiting 3 months for the whole frame to be built, you'd ask to have ready by next week 5 doors, 12 solid panels, 8 windows and so on, and you get the whole kit in a short period of time. And also they had the advantage that it was designed to be taken apart and moved. So if you bought property in the colonies which you had to move from, or you occupied property which was government owned, had to move the house, you could take it apart and move it to a different site, and that was quite often done with these buildings. The first of them reached Perth in 1830, and not much evidence survives of them, but this is one. It's a bit misleading because it's very unusual in having an attic story. But you can see in the lower floor the standard Manning system of those panels looking like large doors in between the grooved posts. After Perth, his big market was Adelaide, and he marketed for South Australian people. This advertisement is typical of it, citing the prominent citizens who had these houses, C.B. Howard, J.B. Hack and so on. And a number of them were built in Adelaide, many of them built in Adelaide, and a few survive today. This is one. It was built in North Terrace, Adelaide, and moved to Burnside later on. You can see the same thing. There are posts and panels in between. There you see them inside. This is another, which is almost entirely invisible now because in an early stage the building was encased in brick, but that had the benefit that later on when work was done on it, timbers could be extracted of the original Manning structure. Now these are not the grooved posts, these seem to be plates, probably the top plates of the walls, and you can see on some of them the markings of Roman numerals, which is typical in prefabricated buildings. They're numbered so you can put them together in the right order. And the question might occur to you, why were carpenters using Roman numerals for this purpose? Surely that's a bit sophisticated for a subliterate carpenter. Why wouldn't they use ordinary Arabic type numerals? Well, of course the reason is that you can cut a Roman numeral with a chisel or a race knife with a straight edge, whereas Arabic numerals are very hard to cut. And so carpenters, not only in Britain but all over Europe, regularly use Roman numerals to mark up their buildings. And this is a Manning building in Adelaide, but not typical. The sizes are different and the different details. The reason is it was not a private house. It was the Friends Meeting House, that is the Quakers, their place of worship in Pennington Terrace. Those are original but very lightweight iron posts. The windows you can see can be opened up to work as doors if necessary. And inside it, it was supplied with the furniture, pews and so on, which are still there. And this is the only surviving example in the world where you have not just a Manning building, but the furniture that belongs to it still in existence. And by the same token, La Trobe's cottage in Melbourne was supplied by Manning, again for a major government official. But in this case, not bought by the government, but bought by La Trobe himself. Latrobe was not supplied with a house by the government. He had to buy his own land and buy his own house, and he bought a small cottage from Manning which could be used in the short term, and a larger house which would take longer to be finished and to come out. But when he got here, he had trouble buying a site at all, and finally he was able to buy the land at Jolimont, which I showed on the plan earlier on, off Wellington Parade. And he built the small house, the small panelled house, on this Manning standard system. And when the larger house came, he never used it. He built it on the corner of his site and let it out to tenants, including Bishop Charles Perry. So this was the only Manning house, as it seemed, surviving in Victoria, with certain qualifications. You're seeing in this view the panel building, the rectangular panel building. At the end, a triangular roof is the dining room, which was built on at the time of erection in 1839 by local builder George Beaver. So that's not prefabricated. A couple of the windows of the Manning house were used in the dining room, where it blocked off the end of the wall. The spare windows were used in the dining room, but otherwise it contains no prefabricated material. So the complex developed like this, with outbuildings at the back as well, and it stood on a site in Jolimont, East Melbourne, it was in the grounds of what became a factory, the Bedggood Shoe Factory. And when the factory expanded, part of it had to be demolished, and in the end, most of the panelised house was destroyed. And when the National Trust acquired this building, there was the end of the panelised house and the dining room, which was built locally. So a very small part of the Manning house survived. The Manning portion is that. So part of the end wall above where the dining room joins on, 2 or 3 panels of the side wall, and then those windows which were moved into the dining room were all that survived of the Manning building. So what we see today in the Domain is in fact largely a replica, not a genuine Manning building. But the dining room itself has very interesting characteristics, which I won't go into today. It's a very important early example of development towards the stud or balloon frame. The next Manning house I want to mention was brought out by a private migrant in the gold rush period, and in his diary, his journal, he records all the details of the house, the components and the instructions for building it, which is a very, very unusual thing to have. Here is the list of components. So these are all numbered, so that when the load is taken off the ship, you can check off that each package has arrived, so we know exactly what the house consisted of. There's the completion of that list. And in the journal, he has the instructions for how to assemble the house. Once again, it's a very unusual thing to have. This house was built in South Yarra by this migrant, Samuel Bradford Vaughan, but moved in about 1870 from South Yarra to Queenscliff, where it became a holiday house. And so many of these houses have been moved. As I said before, they were designed to be able to be moved, and often the need arose to do that. At Queenscliff, it survives today, but it's unrecognisable externally because it's been totally clad on the outside. However, inside it, this house at Mercer Street, now known as Bungalow Cottage, has still the original Manning characteristics visible. The gold rushes, first in California in 1849 to 50, and then in Victoria in 1852 to 3, attracted huge numbers of prefabricated buildings and brought new manufacturers into the field. California was very difficult to reach from Europe, so houses were sent there from Sydney, Hobart, Launceston, Adelaide and Auckland. When gold was discovered in Victoria, there was the same demand for housing, and houses came from the same sources. But we have little information about them except those from New Zealand, one of which survives. Late in 1852, Henry Cook, the founder of the Age newspaper, brought 6 wooden houses from New Zealand and had them put up in various locations in East Melbourne, one being his own house in Clarendon Street, long since demolished. Another of Cook's houses, much smaller, survived well into the 20th century. The iron tiles on the roof would have come from Britain, but the rest is all New Zealand timber. Another 4 houses were imported by the merchant James Raven, who built one of them for himself in Grey Street, East Melbourne. We have no useful picture of it on the site in Grey Street, but today it is at Mount Macedon. In 1881 it was demolished to allow the Grey Street site to be redeveloped, and was bought by Professor John S. Elkington and rebuilt on his land at Macedon. Elkington himself extended it, and subsequent owners continued to expand it. This is what I believe to be the original house in blue and Elkington's first extension in red. The lining boards have recently been stripped and shown to be kauri, which confirms the New Zealand origin. If you look at the map of the world, Australia is very distant from the major sources of prefabricated buildings in Europe and even in North America, which you see marked towards the right of the map. It's closer to Hong Kong and Singapore, which is why we get houses from there at an early stage in Australia. And I'll come back to that connection in a moment. But first of all, here is a house which apparently came from North America. I should perhaps say before I go on that taking a building from Boston or New York to Australia, it meant going right round the south of Cape Horn through very stormy seas, or taking it down to the Panama Isthmus, unloading it and taking it by cart across the isthmus and putting it on another ship. And even to get to California, where the gold rushes were, the same thing had to be done. So Boston and New York were not very well equipped to supply even their own Californian market. There was no road across the United States then, no railway. And so, in a sense, the European ports were almost as close to California as the ports of eastern United States, and certainly as close from the point of view of getting buildings to Australia. This house, which was demolished in 1983, has in the top view a later shop front built onto it. But the house behind is full of interesting American components, and that's what I found on site in 1985. The house was demolished about my ears, and I had limited time to photograph what I could of interest. Here you see stencil marks on the top piece of timber. We don't know what TS stands for, but the next level, CT and Company, it's quite clear. That stands for Caldwell Train and Company. Caldwell Train and Company were a firm of Boston timber merchants who had a branch in Melbourne, which was run by George Francis Train. So know exactly who imported this building and where it came from. Further than that, the bottom stencil, Aberfoyle, refers to the ship on which these components were brought. And you can trace through the shipping lists when the Aberfoyle reached Geelong and Melbourne, and so you can narrow down the number of times when this house could have arrived, which is a very useful technique. Well, those components were not lost. They were put into storage by pioneering collectors, John and Lorraine Rosenberg, and they're still held by their son, Paul Rosenberg, in storage at Geelong, and we hope that one day they'll be put together again. One characteristic of this structure, rather remarkable characteristic, was this long bolt or long threaded tie rod. And why I show you that is it's turned up in another location, the same detail here, a cottage in Williamstown, which is no doubt by the same Boston manufacturer. The rest of the building is now gone. Here's another very different American house. Osborne House in Victoria Street, North Melbourne, which still stands today, was imported by Captain George Ward Cole, a Melbourne merchant. And it's full of American characteristics. The timbers have been identified as American timbers, and the porch design relates to porches done by prominent American architects like Andrew Jackson Downing and Calvin Vaux in the 1850s. So the origins are beyond doubt. There's a connection to the house with a similar porch, and you can see the resemblance. Later on, this became a school, so we have a fairly early representation of it in this flyer for the Ladies' College, which occupied the building at this time in 1870. Here now we're turning from America to British houses. This is a large two-storey timber house made in Britain and exported to Melbourne for a local merchant, Edward de Carle. It was built in Brunswick, but it stood on what became the site of a brick pit and had to be moved to Coburg in the late 1860s. And when it was moved, it was reassembled well, except that the roof frame seems to have been built in a different order. The timbers weren't used in the precise same way, and they're marked in a rather odd fashion. Before we go to the roof, though, here is the side wall of the building. Now look at the left-hand detail. You're looking at what might be This is probably the first
chamfer
built in
East
vertical
Melbourne,
boarding with recessed joints
at a time when
between.
East Melbourne was just laid out.
It's not that because the recessed joints are not timber. They're
at the time when the
iron
Royal took place, it was an opportune
strips
moment
of
to buy
iron
land in East
which
Melbourne
fit into
and
grooves
build houses
in
on
the
these
board
two
below and the board above.
Singapore houses were built
right
in
hand
the area.
and this is
This
characteristic
one
of some of these
is on
Hoddle
buildings
Street,
and also of
and
the
it
survives
survives
on
on
that
some
site.
of these buildings.
We have a
Until
loose spline
late in the century,
joining the boards
once
together.
again the railway line
In that case, the boards
would
would become
demolished. If you go down
tight together and the
Burns
spline would be
Parade
visible
today towards
the same
Holland Street,
principle
you pass
applies.
over a
Made
cutting
in,
and the railway line
timber
can be
along the
seen
floorboards
below
on-
you if you
on
look
iron.
over the edge, and that's the line that. But
required
here in
this
this
building to
house,
be-
there are
to
some
be
of the splines
It was
removed.
moved to,
The wide ones are those for the wall, where you have an
in tone,
exposed section, and the narrow ones are
which
those for the
stood looking
floorboards. Looking like this. Hard to recognise it, that the
Now,
Singapore
going back to
house
the
is
map
intact,
again,
but the
consider
porch
again the
has
fact
been
that
built onto
Hong
it,
Kong and Singapore
and there's
are far
although the
closer
iron tile
to
roof is
Melbourne.
original. Across the along
They
the
sent
top
some
is a
buildings to
terracotta
California
ridging.
first of all.
A similar reason.
Those
They're
tiles we'll see
accessible.
a bit more later on, but
and
they
then
are
when
galvanised
the
tiles
gold
made
rush
by
is
Morgan
broke out
Rogers
in
in
Victoria,
London.
the
They would
makers
have
in
been
Hong Kong and
almost
Singapore
certainly bought in Melbourne,
primed and
not
ready to
brought
go,
in
so
the
very
house from
quickly
Singapore.
they began sending
Because the
buildings
Singapore
down
houses
to
tend to come with a
Victoria.
board roof,
and we have a
and
number of
possibly
surviving
with,
Singapore
oilcloth
houses,
laced
none
over
of them
not with
absolutely
iron
intact, but some
tiles.
covered
Anyway,
and
that house
restored,
stood in
Melbourne as a
in
result.
Tone.
Nowhere
This
else
was
in the world do
1900,
these buildings
but by
survive.
1930s,
That's
the
returned
boundaries have
to
been replaced with a
now.
bungalow-style porch, but you can still see the iron tile roof and the terracotta ridging intact. And it stood here until 1983 when it was demolished, and here it is being demolished, and it showed very many interesting characteristics. This is the first of these houses to be really discovered and studied, so it was a very important example. On the walls you can see typical 1850s weatherboards, that is hand-run quirked beading along the edge, run by the carpenters probably on the site, not done at a timber mill. Inside the rooms were rather long and thin. There were four main rooms, and many of the timbers were marked in this way with an A and a sort of star. And the A is probably the identification of the house. This would come in a batch with other Singapore houses marked A, B, C, and so on. So it's not a numbering for that particular joint; it's the identification of the house itself. And this is the structure of this house, which has been reconstructed here in this drawing. You can see the long, thin form of the rooms. It's divided by a narrow corridor at the centre. And this was recovered after demolition by Andrew Muir, who took it to Collingwood and assembled on his own land. So this is the frame of that house reassembled. And it's very interesting when you come to it in detail. A couple of things to look at. First of all, under the ridge of the roof there are a number of vertical timbers. These are not part of trusses. There are many more vertical timbers than there are horizontal ties across the roof, and the purpose of them is not immediately obvious. Sometimes referred to as toms or tom posts. At the base of the timbers are Chinese characters indicating how you put this place together. They don't have instructions like put tab A into slot B. They are words like moon and flower and so on, which just identify the joint with a particular name. But at the top of the picture, top left, you can see that there are holes through the vertical tom posts, mortise holes, and it seems that there were horizontal rails passing along between each pair of posts, joining them together. And again, what purpose could that possibly serve? It was a mystery until this similarity was pointed out by Janet Beeston, who found that in traditional Malay construction, a horizontal member runs along between the posts of the trusses in the same sort of way. It's hard again to make out what purpose it serves in structural terms. It's not structural, it's constructional, I believe. When you place these timbers in place, before it's all assembled, they're wobbling around, and that horizontal post, I think, holds them in position until you get the whole frame complete, which is why they don't have to remain in position afterwards, why they're missing from the Singapore house we just looked at. They're not required once the building is complete. Here is the same building in plan, showing the location of all those Chinese characters. And here are some of the timber joints, which are not particularly Chinese. They resemble European joints by and large. This is another house which came from Singapore and similarly has a bungalow porch. It was never moved from the site like the previous one, but it was totally altered externally, and you can't see anything much about it that looks like a Singapore building. until you go down to points of detail. Now, behind the fence at the left is the bottom corner of the building, and there, if you look at it closely, you see that the bottom plates, which are big rectangular pieces of timber, intersect each other. They're halved into each other and stick out in either direction, or did stick out in either direction. And the same occurs at the top below the eave. This is a characteristic of a number of these houses. And where the weatherboard is taken away above, you can see that the timber cladding was in fact vertical boarding. So the weatherboard, of course, is later, but the vertical boarding is the original form of the external wall of this building. And there's a similar detail of the cross plates in the Malay tradition. And it seems that these houses were built for the European market, but by Chinese entrepreneurs in Singapore, the businessmen who made them, but possibly using local Malay labour, because in addition to the Chinese characters on the timbers, I found smaller numbers of Arabic characters written on in a more casual fashion, probably by the carpenter on the spot. So this combines Malay and Chinese building traditions. Still in the same house in Prahran as it was, here we are looking through the roof. It had a shingle roof on site, and later on iron was put over it, and there was no trapdoor on the ceiling, so we had to go in through this opening. And here we are inside the roof, and once again we find those mortise holes running through the tom post, rather lower at the level, more like midpoint in this case, but performing the same sort of function for apparently horizontal members to go in between. And here's this house, and it was recovered and moved and reconstructed, once again by Andrew Muir in Collingwood, and you can see the vertical cladding now reinstated throughout the building. Here's a very different sort of building. It's in a sense a Singapore building, but not a prefabricated one, because this building at Romsey near Lansfield was built in the 1850s using a locally cut timber frame, local timbers, but slotted between the frame were pairs of doors. There's the plan of it, around three sides, and here's one of the walls. Broadly speaking, between each pair of posts there was typically a set of double doors. The doors differ in design, but perhaps not so much in this view, but generally speaking, they are matching pairs of doors, although the sizes and the forms differ somewhat.